component, but we haven't talked about how to pass the data or how to communicate between two components, right? So now in this section, we're going to cover the different types of approaches by which you can communicate between the components. So the first approach, that is a very basic and commonly used approach, is parent to child communication, in which you will pass the data from parent to the child. Then there is the second approach that is also most commonly used, is child to parent communication. These first two approaches are good when you have a relationship between two components, right? But there may be a scenario in which the two independent components are there, right? Or we can say the sibling components are there. If you want to do the communication in between them, we go with pub sub approach. And this is an older approach, but I still want to cover it because some cases you might need, or maybe if you are supporting the legacy project or somewhere, so you should have a good understanding of this topic as well. Then the fourth one is the latest one, that is Lightning Messaging Service, in which you can communicate across LWC to LWC component, LWC to Aura, Aura to Visual Force, Visual Force to LWC, all combination this approach covers. And this particular approach will cover in the different section that is called Lightning Messaging Service section. Okay, so we'll start with parent to child communication. So there are total 4 ways by which you can communicate with the child component from parent. And the first approach is in which you pass the primitive data to the child component. Primitive data are the simple data like string, number, boolean. Right. The second approach is you are passing a complex data or a non-primitive data like object, array, or array of object. Right. That is the second approach. The third approach is you are passing the data to a child on an action at parent. Suppose on click of button you want to pass some data to the child. That is the third approach. These first 3 approaches are almost similar, but I just divided into different category to get a better understanding. Then the fourth approach is calling the child method from the parent. So if you have a function inside the child component and you want to access that, or you want to trigger that function from the parent component, that is the fourth approach. So these are the approaches that we're gonna learn under the parent to child communication. To child communication using primitive data type. To understand how parent and child are communicating, first we need to understand @API decorator, because this is the heart for the communication from parent to child. Okay, so till now in a component we have created a local properties, like full name is a local property, right? But if I want to make it public so that other component can able to listen or to able to capture it, we want to create this public. And to create a property or a method to be public, we have to use @API decorator. So for that, first of all, you need to import @API from LWC package. So we are importing it here. And then you need to decorate your property. Like suppose username is my property and I want to make it public, I'll just decorate it with the @API. Similarly, you can do with the method. As soon as you append @API, it is accessible by the parent component as a HTML attribute. Okay, so let's read the slides quickly. To make a field / property or method public, decorate it with @API decorator. When we want to express the property, we decorate the field with @API. Fields and property are interchangeable here. An owner component, in our case that is parent. Okay, an owner component that uses the component in its HTML markup can access the component's public properties via HTML attributes. So as I said, if you define a property with @API, the parent component can access this property using the HTML attribute. We'll see everything in example. Then the public properties are reactive in nature, and if the value of property changes, the component's template re-render. It's similar to a normal property. Okay, so if you change its value and you are using it into HTML, its value gets updated. Okay, these are reactive in nature. So let's go to our first statement, that is first case. We are passing the simple data, that is a primitive data. Parent will pass some data, and in the child will cache the data, and to cache the data we need a property, and that property should be public, and we're gonna change that property with a normal property to a public using @API decorator. So let's go to our VS Code and start writing the code. So I'm in my VS Code. First, we're gonna create the component. So as we are talking about parent to child relationship or parent to child communication, we want two components. So I'll create the first component. I'll give this name P2C. This is just a notation to understand parent to child. Okay, and P2C parent component. And I'll create this. And the second component that I'm gonna use is, I'll say P2C alert component. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna build an alert component that will receive the data from the parent component, and that will receive only the basic data, that is the simple data here, right? Primitive data. So now I have two components. The first thing, I want my component to be exposed. So I'll go to the parent component. We don't want to change anything in the child component because child component gets embedded into the parent. Only the parent component should be exposed. And then we want to set the targets. I'll just add the targets so that this should be available into the app page. Based on your need, you can set the targets to the home page or other pages. So let's go and create an alert component first. And to do that, we can go directly to the Lightning Design System library, search for alert. I'm telling you the approach that we usually use in our real-time projects. Okay, so if I have to build something, I'll go, I want the red color bar sort of thing. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'll just copy paste the class from here. I'll just take this class or div, I'll go back and paste it. Okay, and based on our need, we can change the styling. Okay, like there are many themes and all they are using. Based on your need, you can change it. So in my case, I need not whole class, but I need a alert class. So I can remove this notify. I want only SLDS notify alert class. I don't want texture or any other thing, and I just want the basic red color class, that is theme error. Error will gives us a red color. That's it. Okay, and apart from that, I want the our basic structure, that is lightning card. I'll say lightning card. I'll say title, parent, child, primitive, data, communication, and within the card I'll move my alert card. Okay, and here within the alert I can print, hooray, I got the data. That's it. Okay, I haven't written anything right now in the JS file. Okay, I have only HTML, everything is static data, and now I'm gonna place my child component or the alert component in the parent component, and we already know how to do that. You need to call c hyphen p2c hyphen component hyphen alert hyphen component. So right now I'm just embedding the child component into the parent component. Okay, so now let's deploy this component and see when we place our parent component, are we seeing our child component on the screen or not. So the component is deployed. I already created another app page, component communication. So let's place our component to this particular page. And here you can search P2C parent component. I'll drag it to the first column. I'll hit save, go back. Now you can see that the data is coming, our alert bar is coming, and everything is coming fine, right? But I want this data to be passed from the parent component. Okay, let's go to our component, and title was not coming because I gave the wrong attribute name. Title will come now. I want this data to come from the parent, right? So as I said, we need a power or a property that can receive the data from the parent, right? So I can create a property first. It's similar to the way you create the property. So I create a property message. Okay, this is the local property. This property can only be understood by this component, but I want this property to be a public property or exposed property. So I have to decorate it with the @API decorator. And to get this @API power, you need to import this from the LWC package. Now your message property is public property. Now this property can listen the data that comes from the parent. Okay. So now to use this property in the parent, sorry, this should be in your alert component. The child component we usually create @API, and we are creating importing API from LWC now. Now I want to receive the data from the parent. Go to the parent HTML where your component has been embedded. Right here, use that property as an attribute. Okay, so message is my attribute here, and now I want to pass the data, and the data that I want to pass here is the static data that we were using in the HTML of the child component. I just cut that, come to the parent component HTML and just pass it directly. So I'm telling to this component, you will receive a data in the property message, and in the child component, it will receive the data because it's decorated with @API. As soon as it receives the data, you just bind this property to the HTML of alert component. Right. So this is the basic flow. I'll repeat it again quickly. Okay. Not here. I have to compare it. So first we embed the component, that is the alert component, into our parent component. I want to pass some data to the child. So I need a property name that is public in the child component. So we went to the child component, we create a message property and make it public using @API decorator. Now the message property has the power to receive the data. Now we come to the parent HTML and we use that property message, and we are passing the simple data that is a string. And as soon as you pass, the component loads, it receives the data, and wherever you have used this property in the HTML, you will see your data. Okay, let's deploy this and see. So the component is deployed. I refresh the page, and now you can see that the alert is still showing the data correctly, and the title of our card is also coming correctly. Right. So this is the one way you can receive the data. Okay. Let's play a little bit more in the same use case. So I want this heading to become from the parent only. So I'll go and create the another property in the child, and I'll say API card heading, right? And then I'll go to my parent component. I'll use the attribute. And the catch here is attributes are always lowercase letter, right? They follow the kebab case basically. Okay, so you can't use the camel casing here. If your property is in the form of camel case, it should be converted into the kebab case, so it will be a hyphen heading, right? So now we want to pass the data that is used in the heading. So I'll cut this data and I'll come back to my parent. I'll say, okay, you have to pass the data parent to child primitive data communication, and it will be received by a card heading property that is public in nature. So I'll come to the alert component JS. I'll see, okay, there is a @API. It means my card heading is exposed or a public property. I'll use this into the HTML directly. So I'll bind it here. Okay, let's deploy this and see if this is also working fine or not. This will work definitely fine. Let's refresh the page. And now you can see parent to child primitive data communication is coming fine and the text is coming fine. Now, as I said, the primitive data types are not only string, but it also number or your booleans as well, right? So let's quickly test that as well. So I'll go to the parent component, and in parent, I'm gonna pass some number. I'll use a number property. I'll say number 20. I'll use a boolean property is valid, false. And now in the child component, what I'm gonna do here is I'll create those properties. So I'll say at the rate API number and at the rate API is valid. Okay, is valid is camel case, and in HTML I'm using in the kebab case, right? Let's print them as well in the HTML. So before message I'll print the number, I'll give the space, and after the message I'll print the boolean. Okay, and let's deploy this. So it should print 20 message and the is valid is false, so it should be the false at the end. So let's go for org again. So let's refresh the page. Now you can see that if I zoom it a little bit, the 20 is the number and false is the boolean value, and this is the string data, right? So this is working fine. So we proved it. Primitive data you can pass directly from HTML. And the another key point that many people do mistake, if you defined an attribute but you are not assigned any value, okay, if you define an attribute and you haven't assigned any value, by default the value will be true. Okay, so suppose is valid, I just define the attribute but I haven't initialized with any value or assigned any value, so on the screen by default it should show me true here. So if attribute is present in the HTML, its by default value is true. So just remember this. When you build a reusable component, these things are very helpful when you set the properties like is true, max length, min length in your components. So let's deploy this and confirm this as well. So till now we have learned many things, like you can pass the data in the form of string, number or a boolean. To cache the data from parent to child, we have to use @API. And if your property is camel case, you have to use kebab case in the HTML attribute. So let's go quickly and refresh the page. And now you can see that it's printing true because I haven't initialized with anything, but it was present in the attribute, so the default value is true. So array or object or array of object. So in this also we'll pass the data, but this time the data will be non-primitive, and the approach will be the same. @API decorator will cache the data and we'll use that data to show something on the screen, but this time only the data type is changed. Okay, that is a complex data. So let's go to our VS Code, and for this example also I'm going to use the same parent component that we built in previous example, only the child component I'm going to change. Okay, so the child component that we're going to use this time is, let's create that. I'll say parent to child carousel component. So earlier we create the alert component, this time we're going to build the carousel component. The default path, and it's created the component. So as name suggests, we're going to build the carousel component. So let's go and find the code for carousel component. So first thing, there is a component library given by Salesforce. Click on component reference. In the quick find, you just type carousel and it will show you the carousel. We'll go with the basic carousel. Okay. Or we can search with anything without auto scroll. If you don't want your carousel to be automatically scroll, you can go with the disable auto scroll, and you just gonna copy paste the whole code that is inside the carousel tag. Copy this and come back to our VS Code. Inside the carousel component HTML, we're gonna paste our component. Okay, and we'll just wrap our component with a card and the margin, little bit margin. So I'm just creating the card, lightning card. These things you already know, that's why I just copy paste. So if you don't know, you can watch my previous videos. So I created the card with the title parent to child, non-primitive data communication, and I'm giving the margin around the card. Okay. So I'll copy paste all the carousel. I'll just cut and paste it in between the div. And now our card is ready, the child carousel card. And I'll go and embed this component into my parent component. And we already know how to embed this. What we're gonna do is, so this component should not touch each other component. So I'll add some margin bottom. SLDS variable margin bottom of medium size. Okay, and below this I'll call my another component that we just built, that is carousel, and to call this D2C carousel component and just embed it. So till now I just copy paste the code of the carousel into the child component and just calling the child component and embed it into the parent component. That's it. So let's deploy this component and see whether the carousel is coming on the screen or not. Right now I'm not passing anything to my carousel component from the parent component. So if you go to the org or refresh the page, you will see a second card is coming and it has different images. This is our carousel component. Now I want this data, whether it's an image or the heading or the description, to go from parent to child, right? And these are multiple, so it definitely be an array of objects. So let's create the data. So I'll go to my JS carousel component. I'll just take this data that is required by the carousel image, and I'll come to my parent component. I'll create the carousel data. So create the data, I need a variable for a property. I'll say carousel data. It should be array of object because there are many. So whenever there are many, you always use with the array of object. So I'll say source one property. I need a source. Source should be this. Then we need the second property as header. The header should be first card. Then I need description, and we can say first description. So basically I don't need other things for time being. I just created the property carousel data. In that I created array of objects. Object will work in key value pair. So source is the key, value is the URL, header is the key, first card is the value, description is the key, and the first description. So now I'll just copy paste this thing 3 times and I'll change it to second card, and this is second card, this is third card, and this is our complex data actually. If you look into the, and mainly from Apex you're gonna get the data in this format only. And I'll change the image numbers as well to 2 and 3. Okay, now I want to pass this data down to my child. I'll say okay, you want to pass something. First you should have an attribute or a public property into the child component. So we go here and we'll say carousel details. Okay, and right now it's a private property. To make it public you need add the rate API, and the API should be imported from LWC package. And then your name is carousel details. It should come here. It should write in the HTML attribute format, carousel details. Then you have to assign the data, and the data is inside the JS file of the parent in the property carousel data. So we'll just map that property name here. So immediately it caches the data and it will reach to the property. JS file of the format, carousel details. Then you have to assign the data, and the data is inside the JS file of the parent in the property carousel data. So we'll just map that property name here. So immediately it caches the data and it will reach to the property. And now I want this property to be used to display the HTML, right? So I'll gonna use the for each looping. We already know how the loop work. Within the lightning carousel, I'm gonna call template. I'm gonna use for each loop. On which array you want to run? I want to run on the carousel details. So I want to run the loop on the carousel details, and each item I want to call it as item, and within this loop I'll place our carousel image. Now it's showing an warning because each property should have a unique key attribute, and we can say item dot. If I look into the data, what thing is unique? My header is all unique, so I can say item dot header. Then we have to map the source, so I can say item dot rc, and then I have header. I can say item dot header. Then I have description. I can say item dot description. For time being, we don't need this because we haven't defined these values. So now I looped my carousel image. We are receiving the data from the parent and we are looping it, and it should work as it is, and the complex data is passed so easily. And I showed you how I create the complex data as well. And real time also, if you are building carousel, it's gonna work like this only. Okay, so let's go and deploy this. So the component is deployed. Let's refresh the page, and now you can see that it's working totally fine. It's showing first card, second card, second description, third card, third description, and first card, first description. So this is how you pass the complex data or the non-primitive data from parent to the child. And I showed you with the both real-time examples how you gonna create the alert in real time, how are you gonna create the carousels in real time. So the approach will be almost same. The parent will pass the data, but not directly on click of some action. The action can be on click of button or on change of input field, that it will pass the data. In the child component, the property which is public by @API decorator will cache the data and show on the screen. The approach is almost same. The handling is little bit different. So let's go to our VS Code. So in this example also, I'm gonna use our same component that we are using from the last two videos, that is parent component. I just put the comments to give you a better clarity. This example is for simple data, this example is for complex data. Now we're going to talk about passing data on an action. And to pass the action, first we need to create the input field, I would say. So to create the input field, I will go to our library, that is component reference. Here I'll type input. If you have the code, you don't need to type the code. You should know where to look into. So in the drop down, you look into the text input. And from here, you just copy paste any input just to get the exact design. Come back to your VS Code. And here I'm going to place the input field. I'll change this type to number. And I'll say enter percentage. Okay. We'll not talk about validation and all right now. We are just focusing on how on change or an action I can pass the data to the child. So now I have an input field and I want to pass the data to the child. So first I need a child component, and here we're gonna build a child component, that is progress bar. So let's create the component. I'll say P2C progress component. Now your component is ready. I want a progress bar here. So I'll again go to my library reference. I'll say progress. I'll click on progress bar. We'll take the simple progress bar code, that is single line lightning progress bar. It has a value 50 and it's a large size, and we'll just embed this component into our parent component. We know how to embed this. E hyphen P2C hyphen progress hyphen component. And now we have embedded it, and before that we can add some margin bottom as well, and we can create the card here as well actually to get the better view on the screen. So I'll just copy paste the card, and here is the card component. On the card, parent to child communication and action, whatever we have built, I am just placing it inside these cards. I am saying type number and enter percentage and the my component progress. So let's deploy these components and see how it looks on the screen. So I'll deploy this, and now I should see a card with the heading parent to child communication on action, which has some input field as well as the progress bar. So now it's deployed. Let's go to our page and refresh the page. Now on the bottom you can see there is an input field and there is a progress bar. Now I want, if you look at our code, this field is at parent level and this progress bar is at child level. I want, whenever I'll change some value here, my progress bar will change accordingly. Okay, that's the actual purpose of this demo, which means parent to child communication on action. Let's go and try to achieve that. So first thing, we need to understand what all properties get changed. So I'll come to my progress component. I'll see there is a hard-coded value already in the value. So we'll say replace this with the property progress value, and we'll create this property inside the JS file progress value. But we want to cache the data from the parent, then we have to change this local property to a public property using @API decorator, and we need to import the API from the LWC package. Now this is a progress value and this is a public property. Now I'll go to the parent component HTML and I'll say, hey listen, I want some value to be passed from you. Okay, and it says okay, I'll pass it, but I can pass hard-codedly, but I don't want it. I want whenever the input value change something, this value should get passed. Okay, so what I'm gonna do here, I'll say I'll pass the percentage property to you. Okay, right now the percentage property is not there, but I'll create it in a minute. And my attribute should be a kebab case, so I'll change it to kebab case from camel case. First, I'll go to my HTML, to my JS file. I'll create a property percentage. Okay, I'll initialize it with the 10. Okay, so by default, when the progress bar loads, it will receive the 10 value as the default value. And I want, whenever I change it here, something in my input field, it's update that percentage value. For that, I need event handler. So I'll say on key up change handler, and I'll say the value attribute for you is the percentage. That's the value attribute, and change handler will get called as you start typing on key up, and this change handler will receive an event, and I want this value to be updated. So I'll say this dot percentage equal to event dot target dot value. So as soon as you type something, that value comes here. It's update our percentage property. As soon as your percentage property gets updated, it will pass down to our child component, because that is bind to a child component attribute progress value. As soon as the updated value goes down, progress value will listen that value. It comes to here progress value, and once it receives the updated value, it re-render the component and it update the value here. So let's deploy and see whether it's working fine or not. And this is your third component. Now you know how to create alert, how to create carousel, and now the third component, how to create the progress bar. So I refresh the page and let's go down. Now you see by default we set it to 10, and the input field receive the 10 and the progress bar has the 10 value. As soon as I start changing it, now you see my progress bar is changing accordingly. So if it is 50, 30, 20, 19, 18, so everything is updating in the child. So this is an example in which I am demonstrating you how you can pass the value to a child on click or on performing some action. This is a basic example. You can play around with it. You can build any other example that you have in your mind while practicing. You get a better idea. So that's it. We are just communicating using the properties. When we make our properties reactive or a public using @API, we are able to communicate. But this time we're gonna change from property to a method. We'll make our method public and we'll try to communicate. And in this case, the approach will little bit different from the other three. Other three were almost same approach, but here the approach is totally different, I would say. So in this case, the child component will have a method and that method will be public. And to make the method public, we're gonna use @API, and that method we're gonna call from the parent directly. Okay, so let's go to our VS Code and see in a demo. So for this, I need a child component again. And this time we're gonna talk about slider. We'll create a slider component. I'll say P2C slider component. In the slider component HTML, I'm gonna create the lightning card. That card will have title. Title will have calling child method from parent. This technique you're gonna use couple of times when you don't have any other way to pass the method or pass the data or to call the inner method of a component. So I'll give some margin as well, SMDS for margin around. This is the basic syntax we are using from our many videos. Now I want a slider. Let's go back to our library. I'll look for a slider here. You will see a slider. Click on slider and we can pick up the basic slider. So in the drop down there are different types, you can play around with it. So I'm going with a basic slider. So if I change this value, the value is updating here. So this is the code, one line code. I'll just copy this and paste it here. And this value it's gonna use is the value that comes from the JS. Whatever the value you set it here, I'll say the value is 20. So it will receive the value 20 here, right? So let's go and deploy this. First, before deploying, we want this component to be available. Now let's embed this component to our same parent component. So I'll say C slider component. And now let's deploy this and see working or not. So it's deployed. Let's refresh the page. Now onto the bottom, you will see our another component calling child method from parent. And we are able to load our slider. I'll zoom it a little bit. Yeah. So now this is the default value, that is 20. As soon as you update, it's updating the value, right? And let's go to our component back. And now I want this value to be reset to a center or to a 50 from the parent component. And apart from that, I want on change, I should able to update this value as well. I'll say change handler. I'll call this method here, change handler. Will receive the event, and we'll say this dot val. This val is a local property. We haven't used @API yet. So I'll say event dot target dot value. So whatever the value comes, it updates our val property. As soon as it's update our slider. Now I want a way by which my parent call a button or a click a button and it reset it to 50. Okay, so first I need a button. I'll again go back to my library. I click on button. I'll take the button code. You can pick up any button code. I can pick up brand. Just copy paste this. We are pasting the button now just above our component. I'm saying my button brand is variant is brand, that is a blue color. I want reset slider. So label is reset slider. I don't need title. I don't need right now a class even. Okay. We'll make our things very simple. On handle click, I'll call my JS file, and here I'll create a method. And now this is the trick actually how you can call. Okay, first we need a method that should get called from the parent. For that, we'll create a method here, reset slider. This is my method name. Method, you know how you create it. This is the basic approach. And what we are saying, we'll set it to 50, because out of 100, reset slider to 50. Okay, every time you click the button, it should set to the 50. And I want this method to be exposed to the parent, and you can only expose it to parent using @API. This is an example of how you make your methods public. Okay, till now we just make our properties public, but this time we are making our method public. Now API is there. We imported it from LWC. Now slider is there, right? So now I want this method to be called from JS of the parent. To call this parent, first we need the reference of the component. For that, what we're gonna use, this dot template dot query selector, and query selector will take either a class or the element. So our element for the child is C-P2P, how we are embedding the component basically. I'll say fetch this element, and once you fetch, call the method that is public reset slider. Just dot and reset slider. So first you need the reference of the component from which you want to call the method, then you just call the method name. Just make sure your method should be publicly exposed, and to expose your method you have to use @API. As soon as you click, its value become 50. Let's deploy and see if it's working or not. I have used this in couple of real-time examples, like when you work with a file upload and there are multiple files are uploading, and at the end you want all the files that you have uploaded, you can use this approach. So let's go and refresh the page. Let's go down. We have a slider, reset slider button. We have by default it's load on 20. And if I directly click here, it will reset it to 50. Now you can see it's immediately bring it to the center and it set it to 50. If I change it to somewhere else and if I click it again, it will reset to 50. So from parent, this button is in parent component. I am calling the child method, and that child method is just updating the value. So these are the different ways by which you can communicate from parent to child. So we have covered all 4 ways now. Now I hope you guys have better understanding when to pass the primitive data, when to use the non-primitive data, how you can pass the data to a child on an action, and how you can call the child method from the parent. So you have covered all these points.